keep listening, we keep adding, we keep learning more. But we're moving now into the understand phase, where we begin to make sense of the data we've collected in a really systematic and empirical way, and starting to understand what it is that we're seeing and map it and really create a territory of the narrative, determining the attention, the network and power metrics, identifying the most distinctive narrative communities, mapping these communities. We'll show you how to do that. We've got a really cool mapping tool that Fede has developed that will help with that to make it look nice and play with the different shapes. We're going to be identifying the frames of these narrative communities, and we'll speak to that in more detail, mapping these frames onto the framework and creating your narrative objective eventually, which is sort of like your arrow of change, right? So we're in this phase of understanding what we've heard, understanding what we're learning, mapping the capacity for change. As I was sharing in my group, sometimes folks were seeing overlap between different narrative communities, and people that are bridge builders between different narrative communities. That can be really potent spaces where you're seeing narratives, kind of have certain shared qualities, or people that are able to speak in two different narrative worlds, right? Those might be some of your change makers that you target in terms of your narrative objective and how to move the whole system to a new space. So in the understand, we're mapping the narrative communities and thinking about how the attention, network, and power play into that. Where's their attention? Where are their big networks? Where's their power? And we call it, sort of social acupuncture. So where is the point that there's possibility to shift what we call the window of discourse? And we'll speak about this more in the mapping and the narrative strategy piece. So we're doing our listening in the world, and that's feeding into our point of view. We'll share the example of the territories of transition and some of the narrative communities around land is property, land is money, land is sacred. What does that mean? How do we map that and understand that space and where there's movement and possibility for change? We speak about the axis of justice. So moving from systems of oppression towards regenerative systems, with the center being status quo. And that's really, the goal is to start to move this. But a lot of times in systems acupuncture, you're not going to place the pressure in areas where there's the most frozenness, right? So the systems of oppression and sometimes the status quo are really stuck. So we're looking for places where there's enough space for movement and enough catalytic capacity to actually make a shift. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at your different narrative communities. Fede, I think I'll pass it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Aubrey. Yeah, so in this specific example, right, the idea is that we can start mapping our narrative communities in this justice axis, right? So when we hear our conversation around land ownership, we can see that land as a commodity is very into the injustice part of this axis. It reinforces the systems of oppression, right? While the land back conversation and narrative community is a specific alternative to the system, right? How can we change the land ownership and decolonize that land ownership? But then we are also listening to the back to the land communities, which are also talking about coming back to other ways of relating to the land. And that feels like a regenerative system too, right? So as you can see, we can map into this justice axis, like the different narrative communities. But then there is another axis that we want to put into the space, which is the axis of ontology. And ontology, again, is the ways of understanding and the ways of living, right? So an ontology has to do with that. So in the bottom part of this map, we will see the Western ontology, right? Which we have already named as a monoculture, which is reinforcing a lot of the ways of understanding and thinking about the world that are individualistic, that are seeing nature as a commodity too. So, this idea of being able to also map the knowledge systems is important, because then as we go into the upper side of this axis, we start to see the plurality of being and existing and thinking, right? So that's where there's an ontology shift, or the onto shift that we are calling, right? So there is the possibility to go into the justice axis, but also the need of moving into this plurality of knowing and being, which we call the onto shift, right? So when we put both axes together, we can start imagining this narrative territory, right? And of course, like a narrative has many more axes and many more different layers, but for the sake of this process of creating a strategy, we want to use this two-axis map so that we can start seeing where a narrative community is actually living, right? So as you can see, we will have the justice axis, on one side the injustice, on the other side the justice, and then the knowledge axis, which will have the monoculture on the bottom part and the onto-shift on top. And we can start seeing also specific, like quadrants in this map, right? So the very clear and like almost all of your hegemonic narrative communities will live on the bottom left side, which is the injustice plus monoculture, right? So these are narrative communities that are reinforcing the structures of oppression and single ways of knowing and being, right? But then on the bottom of this quadrant, we can also see the injustice plus ontofake, and we call ontofake because these are this is where some of the narrative that are co-opting our narratives or our language, like we just were talking about how the regeneration frame, right? It's being co-opted by a lot of especially the techno-solutionism world and all of that. So that's where some of those communities who reinforces structural oppression but co-ops the change framing will live, right? And then on the other side, we will have the justice plus shift, right? Which is actually the ones that combine both the search for justice and kind of this restructuring of the system, right? While at the same time is making available other ways of understanding the world, which will also bring us, like to new possibilities of change, right? So the justice plus shift combines transformative systems with plural ways of knowing and being. And on the bottom side of this quadrant, we'll leave the justice plus reform, right? And we know a lot of these community narratives too. So this narrative community seeks reformist change through conventional knowledge and structures, right? So we will see a lot of the institutional change spaces, the communities that are trying to, like create a change within the existing system, right? So I hope that this is useful for you to start thinking on how you can already start mapping the narratives that you have found during your listening process. So let's go into a very specific example, right? Here are 3 narrative communities from this land listening. So we have the private property, which is an hegemonic narrative, the plot to convert the land into merchandise, individual ownership, right? So this is a very clearly hegemonic narrative that has a lot of power and a lot of influence into the narrative space. Then we have the land back, which we have also called this an alternative community. And you will see that catalytic and alternative might be tricky because some of them might be alternative and catalytic at the same time, right? But this community is talking about recovering the land within the institutional framework, but also the restoration of governance and cultural practices from ancestral peoples. And finally, there is a third narrative community who is talking to back to the land. So it's the return to other relationships with the land, the territory, body, and spirit, the cure of the earth, right? So we have found these narrative communities, and now we can actually map them into these knowledge plus justice axis. But this is how it sees your actual definition of a narrative community, right? You have very briefly a description, the attention of this community, the network, and the power. So all of these will be useful for the map, but also for starting to create some specific insights about what is possible to change into the narrative. We will talk a little bit more about the frames and logics in a couple of minutes, so keep that just pinned. But the idea is that we can actually describe very deeply a narrative community, so we can then map it, right? So as we said, the private property narrative community is very big and is very influential into the narrative space. So the power and the influence of a community will be how big or how small is a narrative community in our map. So just for the sake of this mapping, we just will call it, like it has high power or high influence, it has medium influence or low influence, right? So you can make big circles, medium circles, or small circles, right? So again, the private property is very big, and it might even be co-opting part of these ideas of other ways to relating to the land, but at the end, it has to do with parceling, private property, and that's kind of the story of capitalism and colonialism, right? So again, the land back narrative community is into the alternative space and might be specifically fighting for this rematriation of the land through the existing framework of laws and policies, right? So that's why it's a little bit into the into the downside, but it's also kind of touching this part of thinking of other ways of imagining the land relationship. And finally, the back to the land might be the one who has less influence into the narrative space, but it is the one that is higher in the justice plus ownership axis, right? So this mapping is the one that will help us. And in the next session, we will talk about the window of discourse. But for now, just think that this is the reason why you were working on the narrative communities and kind of going in depth into them so that we can understand better this narrative space and who is participating in this specific narrative that you want to hack. So I know that this is a lot, so we will just keep 1 second for breathing before we move forward.